We were promised a nation that would promote the general welfare, but whose welfare did they mean? From mothers' pensions that helped white widows but excluded black mothers, to a new deal that built a safety net with holes big enough for whole communities to fall through. America's welfare system was never colorblind. It was constructed to protect some families while punishing others for even needing help. Welfare wasn't born out of compassion, it was born out of control. This episode isn't just about policy, it's about power. How race, gender, and morality shaped who was seen as deserving of care. And how those definitions still echo today every time we debate about who's earned the right to eat and to rest and to heal. And this is Equity Matters, and we present to you Hunger Games, We the People. You're listening to Equity Matters, where we champion equity in every conversation. I'm your host, Dr. James Bell III, and I talk about places where policy meets people and what justice sounds like when we actually listen, because the narratives we share have the power to move hearts, to shift culture, and to change policy. And so today, we're going there. And I want to trace the roots of what we now call welfare. At its simplest, welfare is a promise. It is a safety net for when life doesn't go as planned. These government provided supports are for individuals and families in need. And so when you hear about things like SNAP and WIC and TANF and Medicaid and CHIP and so many others, when you hear those program names, think about the families that rely on them every month. And these are not just statistics, but these are real people. And unfortunately, the public misperception is that welfare is often framed as a handout or a reward for laziness. But in reality, most recipients are working families, their children, older adults, or people who are facing unexpected crises. These programs aren't charity, they're actually part of a social contract, though too often that contract has been broken along lines of race, class, and gender. I had a chance to hear Tim Wise speak earlier this week, and he said something provocative, but it stuck with me. And that's really what prompted this episode. I've been racing to get to the microphone because he said, America has always hated poor people. When you trace the roots back of the American welfare system, and this is particularly interesting to me because I teach a course on understanding and mitigating poverty. And the first thing that we often talk about is knowing about the English poor laws. And it introduced this concept of the deserving versus the undeserving poor, and how moral judgment was determined to access aid. Whether someone could receive assistance wasn't just based on need, but it was whether society judged their behavior and their lifestyle to be acceptable. So, in other words, aid was conditional on morality. You had to be seen as worthy or deserving. Now, if you appeared lazy or irresponsible, you were often denied help. Widows and single mothers were deserving if they fit the ideal caregiving and respectability, so often white women. Now, able bodied poor people, or people with certain family structures, or black people, or immigrants, were often considered undeserving and they were excluded and stigmatized. So, from the very beginning, aid wasn't meant for everyone, it was a tool to define who counted as human and who didn't. If enslaved and indigenous people were excluded from public support, it only reinforced racial hierarchies. But let's fast forward to the early 1900s. The first state run welfare programs were aimed at widows and single mothers. You heard about mother's pensions or mother's aid or widow's aid. These were cash payments that were distributed to impoverished single mothers in the United States during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And it was initially designed to allow white mothers to stay at home and care for their children. And they had the nerve to frame this as a civic duty. You had middle class reformers, social workers, and women's organizations like the National Congress of Mothers who argued that motherhood was essential to the nation's strength. Now, I don't disagree. They felt if a respectable woman was widowed or abandoned, society had a responsibility to help her stay home and raise her children. This was seen as a civic investment, not in women's equality, but in preserving a stable, white, middle class citizenry. Keeping white mothers at home was seen as protecting the future of democracy. Motherhood was framed as patriotic labor. Your sacrifice was work that produced the next generation of white Americans who would contribute to the nation. So at that time, welfare wasn't a right or an entitlement, it was a reward for moral motherhood that served the public good. Good mothers were going to raise good citizens. And what I'm amazed by in all of this is what it suggests about children. Children of deserving mothers were viewed as future assets to the state. These are future workers, future voters, future soldiers. But the children of undeserving women, the black ones, the indigenous ones, the poor ones, or the unmarried ones, they were seen as potential burdens and threats. And if we fast forward to the New Deal era, everything changed. Welfare became a national conversation because of the stock market crash. It broke the backbone of everyday life. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans were unemployed. Banks failed by the thousands, wiping out life savings overnight. There was no FDIC, there was no unemployment insurance, no social security. So when you lost your job, you lost everything. You had families out there who were forced to sell furniture, to sell their clothing and their wedding rings just to buy food. You had starving children. Schools actually had to shorten their year or shut down entirely because towns couldn't pay their teachers. And poverty had finally become visible in a way that America had never seen before. It wasn't just in cities, but it was across farms and suburbs and small towns. Before the Depression, poverty was viewed as a personal failure. It was the result of laziness, it was bad choices. But the scale of the crisis made it impossible to sustain. Poverty was now a collective condition, not just an individual one. And the New Deal forced an economic policy and an ideological shift. The government would now play an active role in protecting citizens' livelihood. We had finally reshaped the American social contract, but of course, that contract had some fine print. Many of the New Deal programs explicitly excluded agricultural and domestic workers. And these are categories that at that time covered about 65% of black workers and nearly 80% of black women in the South. Those jobs like sharecroppers, maids, cooks, nannies, field laborers, that was the Southern economy. Yet, because of political compromise with Southern segregationists, those workers were written out of the very policies meant to guarantee economic security. Race and power decided who deserved help, and lawmakers in the South agreed to support the New Deal only if they could maintain white control over black labor. So, excluding agricultural and domestic workers meant that black workers stayed economically dependent and vulnerable. So, in essence, the government used welfare policy to preserve a racial hierarchy, protecting the Southern labor system and white supremacy under the guise of national recovery. When Americans first began seeing government relief programs take shape in the 30s and the 40s, the image of need was overwhelmingly white. You had posters and newsreels and political speeches that framed welfare around the white working class family. The husband who was temporarily out of work, the wife that was managing the home, and the children who were looking upward with hope. This wasn't accidental. This was political storytelling. FDR's administration and local welfare officials knew that to win over skeptical white voters, especially in the South, They had to present welfare as help for our kind of people. And so the messaging is this isn't charity, it's support for good, honest, respectable families who just need a little help to get back on their feet. But respectable carried racial and moral weight. It implied white and heterosexual, married, able bodied, and working. So while white Americans were portrayed as temporarily struggling, Black Americans and other people of color were often painted as permanently dependent. That early public messaging, that imagery of relief programs really centered around white nuclear families, that hardworking man that had fallen on hard times. And this was deliberate. Policymakers wanted to make welfare palatable to white voters. You had black and brown families that were depicted as burdens and as cheaters, and these stereotypes would evolve into the welfare queen that continues to be pervasive in these conversations. And the media at that time really reinforced those lines. You had news photos of white mothers waiting in bread lines, and they were framed with empathy. They had faces of patience and shame, but dignity. But when you have black mothers appearing in those same stories, they were often surrounded by language of pathology. You start to hear about broken families, moral decline, poor choices. Black poverty was a social problem to be studied, not a crisis of justice to be solved. And by the 1960s, the ground was shifting. The civil rights movement wasn't just about lunch counters and buses anymore. It began to ask harder questions about economic justice. If America could outlaw segregation, why couldn't it also guarantee housing, health care, jobs, and dignity for everybody? And this question made people uncomfortable, especially those in power. And when you had black activists, poor white farmers, and Latino laborers began organizing together under the banner of the Poor People's Campaign, they reframed poverty as a structural failure, not a personal one. And that was a threat. This is where welfare started to lose its innocence. Because during the Great Depression, welfare was patriotic. It was proof that the government could help real Americans in crisis. But by the 1960s, when those faces of those in crisis were increasingly black and brown, that same compassion, well, that was controversy. Coverage had then shifted from empathy to accusation. These were stories about dependency and fraud and generational poverty. This replaced that earlier language of recovery and resilience. What happened? So when you hear the word welfare, what face comes to mind? For many of us, it's not an accident that they imagine a black mother may be surrounded by children, probably in public housing, and they're struggling. News broadcasts and local papers began showing welfare offices filled with black mothers, and their images were paired with statistics about rising costs. But at the same time, white families who were still receiving benefits faded from the camera. You didn't see them in the pictures. And this new face of welfare wasn't random because it was manufactured. It was crafted to turn the public against the expanding social safety net just as it began to reach those historically excluded from it. Politicians began using welfare as a racial code word. It was a way to talk about race without talking about race. Y'all remember me talking about the call for law and order. It's the same thing here. And now you hear about personal responsibility and work requirements. These are all part of a larger narrative that the government's compassion had gone too far and helping the poor had become a moral weakness, and we lost that desire for civic duty. And yet again, America redefined who was deserving once again. And this time, the line between race and class became nearly impossible to separate. And here's why I wanted to get into this episode. I want to talk about the welfare queen. By the late 1970s, America had entered a new phase of economic anxiety. We had inflation, job loss, rising energy costs, and a deep mistrust in government. But rather than asking why working people were struggling, politicians began asking who was to blame. And for many Americans, that blame was redirected toward the poor, especially black women. During his 1976 presidential campaign, Ronald Reagan began telling a story on the campaign trail. He described a woman on Chicago's South Side. She had 80 names and 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, and was supposedly collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars in benefits. It was a sensationalized, to say the least, barely true story rooted in one woman's criminal case, but Reagan repeated it so often that it became a symbol. The welfare queen wasn't about fraud, she was about fear. The fear of a black woman living well on a taxpayer's dime. And then Reagan took that narrative even further when he told another story. You got to remember, he was a celebrity. This time, he told a story about the young bucks, which is a racially coded term for black men, as they were buying T-bone steaks with food stamps while working people struggled to afford hamburger meat. He never had to say black because everyone knew what he meant. These stories did the work of racism without ever naming race. In all this time, welfare went from helping hardworking families, white families, to supposedly rewarding laziness and fraud, aka black families. And this myth fueled real policy change. We saw cuts to benefits, we saw the rise of workfare programs, you had more surveillance on welfare recipients, and you had public shaming campaigns, all built on this idea that the poor couldn't be trusted. And because America hates poor people, politicians had convinced a generation that poverty was a choice and welfare was theft. But here's the truth: most people on welfare were children, it was the elderly, it was working adults struggling to make ends meet, and most of them were white, though black families were disproportionately represented. And yet, the face of dependency in the American imagination was a black woman. And that's not because of data, but because of design. When we talk about welfare today, we're not talking about an abstract policy or political talking points. We're talking about millions of families whose ability to eat, to feed their children, and to survive depends on government stability. Programs like WIC and SNAP, they serve as the modern face of welfare. And right now, as the federal government teeters during a federal shutdown, that face is anxious, that face is exhausted, and that face is overlooked. I want to just point out something, thinking about WIC and SNAP in particular. And I did a reel on this, so it's still fresh in my brain. But WIC serves over 6 million pregnant women, new mothers, and children under the age of 5. SNAP helps feed more than 40 million Americans, most of them working families and children. And so these programs, they're not luxuries. They are literal lifelines. And in a shutdown, those lifelines can fray very quickly. WIC's funding is not guaranteed. If this shutdown stretches on and clinics close, benefits are going to stop and formula shelves are going to go empty. And SNAP can only run on reserve funds for a limited time before you have to start rationing assistance. Meanwhile, the political rhetoric remains cold and detached. You have debates about spending caps and fiscal responsibility, while you got mothers standing in grocery aisles doing the math on milk and diapers and which one they can afford. The reason it's even possible to let these programs hang in the balance is because of these narratives that we have inherited. For generations, we've been taught that helping poor people, especially black and brown families, is an act of charity, not justice, and that poverty is a reflection of personal failure. Sometimes cutting benefits is tough love. But the truth is simpler. America still hates poor people. And so that hatred now hides behind budget line items and sound bites. And I will never put out an episode that's only problems because I also have to talk about solutions. What can we do? The first thing we got to do is start rejecting the myths every single time they show up. When you hear welfare abuse, ask who's being depicted and why. When you hear politicians say spending cuts, ask who's paying the price. When someone claims people just don't want to work, what kind of work is being valued and who's being left behind? Because those narratives don't just shape opinions, as we've heard through this entire episode, they shape policy. And then we can take action. We can support local food banks and WIC clinics because they feel the pain of shutdowns first. Donate money if you can. Volunteer your time. Share their stories. Remind people that these are not faceless agencies, they are community lifelines. You got to contact your representatives. Call them, email them, post publicly. Demand immediate and sustained funding for SNAP and WIC. They're not extra programs, they are moral obligations that uphold public health. It's been proven to have impact on child development, and it's about human dignity. November's right around the corner. We got to vote. We got to vote in every election, not just the big ones. Because local and midterm elections, they might decide budgets. They appoint agency leaders. They determine whether equity is going to be a priority or an afterthought. Because change doesn't always start at the top. Sometimes it starts at the county board meeting. And we gotta tell better stories. Because storytelling is policy work. We gotta talk about families, not stereotypes. We talk about dignity. We gotta share the truth that government aid isn't a gift. It's a reflection of our shared responsibility. So as we sit in this moment when federal shutdowns threaten the most basic supports for families, I don't think the urgency could be any clearer. This isn't abstract policy, this is real life. It's mothers, it's fathers, it's caregivers, it's children who deserve stability and not uncertainty. And in times like this, brave voices, the social workers, the public health professionals, the community organizers, they're the ones that are holding it all together. So, to those who are doing the difficult, often invisible work, thank you. Your labor keeps the promise of public welfare alive. If you're listening, I need you to stay engaged. I want you to subscribe to the Equity Matters listserv. I just brought it back. The link is in the bio. Share this episode with anyone working in social services or public health, anyone who's in a caregiving role, anyone who's ever needed assistance in their life. They need to hear this because the narratives that we share have the power to move hearts, to shift culture, and to change policy. I want you to stay reflective and stay courageous. This has been Equity Matters because equity always matters.